did you have a notion in your mind already that you were trying to prove?
I was a convinced theist for philosophical reasons. We will not consider anything outside that box.
How much have you looked into psychedelics?
I don't know anything about this.
Wouldn't you like to actually say hi?
Say hi.
Like say hello to God.
Yeah, well, I worried that I was insane.
I think there's a real danger of being an elite intellectual.
The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
It's a long interview, so let's stick with the best parts. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Recently, the Joe Rogan Experience hosted Dr. Stephen Meyer, best known as an advocate for the intelligent design movement and other forms of incredulity. But Joe Rogan won't talk for 3 hours without exploring some side topics. And the interview came to my attention when it strayed into my field of interest, evidence for Christianity and justification for the resurrection of Jesus.
How do you reconcile with the reality that the Bible was written down, at least, by human beings, and that human beings are generally unreliable, at least in terms of 100% accuracy, and also inclined to manipulate each other, especially when they're in control of large groups of people, and also inclined to appease the instincts and the desires and needs of their followers? So they create texts that resonate with the people and develop a philosophy that resonates with the people. And if they say that it comes from God itself, who, especially if it resonates, especially if it makes sense, and maybe perhaps it is in some way from God because it is coming from this divine inspiration.
These are amazing questions for Christians. We know that humans like to manipulate and control, and religious texts are tools for bad actors to manipulate and control. Sadly, we will never get to hear the direct answers from Stephen because the questions from Joe just kept coming.
But how do we know? When something's written down, and also we're translating it, right? We're translating it from, Aramaic, from ancient Hebrew, and it goes into Latin and Greek, and there's a lot going on there. And then eventually to English, and there's a lot of room for interpretation.
There seems to be some misconception in the general public about how Bible translation worked in the past and the present. No modern editions of the Bible are translations of translations. They directly reference the original languages: Hebrew for the Old Testament, Greek for the New Testament, and a smattering of Aramaic in each. The New Testament introduces some translation of translation hiccups, in that when the Greek writers quoted the Old Testament, they were quoting a Greek translation rather than the Hebrew directly.
That's not important right now.
I happen to be a believing biblical Christian. I believe the Bible's witness. I just need to say that not all proponents of intelligent design hold my viewpoint about religious matters, and it'd be unfair to them for me to answer the question without making that proviso, because I'm also here representing those books and those arguments.
Intelligent design is a bit of a delicate coalition of theists who otherwise rarely get along.
There's a tendency to point fingers about motivations. Oh, you religious people believe this stuff because it gives you comfort. And the religious argument to the atheists is, oh, you atheist materialists, you disbelieve because it gives you moral freedom and you don't have to be accountable to a moral judge.
You just want to sin.
And I think in each person there's that push-pull. There's motivations to believe, there's motivations not to believe. And one of the benefits of philosophical training is the attempt, at least, to extricate debates from those motivations. That's they're essentially ad hominem arguments, and we try to avoid those as much as possible on both sides.
Perfect. Agree.
And then we have different discussions about
I want to know your thought process.
Okay, so my thought process. So crucial event in, for example, the New Testament is the trial and death of Jesus of Nazareth and subsequent resurrection.
Confirming the death of Jesus is on a whole different plane than confirming his trial. which in turn is a whole different dimension than confirming a resurrection.
One key, really striking thing that I've discovered in my avocational interest in archaeology is that the 5 or 6 leading figures, most important figures in that trial narrative, which take up about a quarter to a third of the 4 Gospels, have all been independently attested by archaeological inscriptions in the last 50 or 60 years.
As far as I can tell, only 3 figures associated with Jesus' trial in the Gospel have been independently attested by archaeology. There's the Pilate stone that was discovered in 1961, which bears an inscription mentioning Pontius Pilate as the prefect of Judea during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. A burial cave was discovered in Jerusalem that contained ossuaries with inscriptions, one of which is believed to bear the name Joseph, son of Caiaphas. This inscription aligns with the name of the high priest Caiaphas, who is mentioned in the Gospel accounts. Coins bearing the name of Herod Antipas have been found in archaeological contexts, providing evidence of his rule and presence during that period. None of the other named figures, Joseph of Arimathea, Simon of Cyrene, Annas, Judas Iscariot, Barabbas, Peter, or Nicodemus, have archaeological finds affirming their presence. Either Stephen has access to archaeology I'm not aware of, or he misspoke on this. If I missed someone, let me know in the comments.
There were some construction workers working in Caesarea Maritima in Israel in 1960-ish, turned over a big slab of rock, and on the back was an inscription from Pontius Pilate listing himself as the governor of Judea with a tribute to Tiberius Caesar. Significant because in the Gospels, the ministry of Jesus is reported to have occurred when Tiberius was the Roman emperor, Pilate was the governor.
Joe will get there, but suffice to say that correctly identifying the emperor and governor of a region is the lowest possible bar in historical accuracy.
Ronald Reagan killed those whales.
I'm working for Bill Clinton.
Yeah, President Bush and my dad were in the same fraternity.
Do you believe that our president, Barack Obama, murdered anyone when he was in high school?
So there's a weight of external corroborating evidence supporting the historicity of these narratives. And that gives you, I think, a good reason to take the narrative seriously and to evaluate their other claims. It's, in fact, a level of corroboration that I think is almost unprecedented for any document that old. So that's
corroboration in terms of the narrative of the stories, or corroboration in terms of the historical figures being real?
Exactly. Great question, Joe.
both.
Both?
In Josephus,
The narrative of the stories being the resurrection of Jesus?
reports of same.
The distinction here is very important. Stephen has evidence that people reported Jesus' resurrection, not evidence that Jesus resurrected.
You find reports of there's 2 different texts of Josephus, one that was likely doctored by medieval Christians that historians rightly regard as too affirmative in his expression of belief in Jesus of Nazareth, and one that came to us through the Arabic world, where the Josephus text is much more credible, where he records the basic facts of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, including being crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Maybe, but even so, I'm not concerned about the dying part. The Arabic version of this text also merely affirms that people were claiming Jesus was alive. We already knew that people were claiming that Jesus was alive. That's what Christianity is.
And then that there were reports that he had appeared to many after being resurrected. So there's a whole...
Right, but there's reports of Bigfoot.
Right again, Joe. But at least for Bigfoot, we have first-hand reports. For Jesus' resurrection, all we have are reports of reports, at best. More likely, reports of reports of reports of reports. Bigfoot is in higher evidential standing.
Well, right, but we have
You know?
I
mean,
love your
human being,
I love your
particularly back then,
Yeah.
where there's no real access to universal information like the internet. There's no real, there's no libraries. Like, where are you getting all your information from?
Exactly. We know that false information can spread rapidly in a generation with fact-checking tools in their pocket, and even with principal players desperately, actively trying to correct the information. How much more likely is it that thousands of years ago, that stories could grow and be accepted.
You have one of the best formats in all of Talk Anything because you have these long-form discussions. But I think even this format will not lend itself to being able to wrestle the question of the...
Right.
True or not. That sounds like Stephen doesn't have a good answer. That's okay, Stephen. I've never actually heard a good answer, even with unlimited time.
No,
Historical
I don't think we're going to wrestle it. I just want to know why you.
Right. So I think there are three great scholars who have addressed the question of whether or not actually four.
Okay. So instead of providing the evidence that convinced him, Stephen is going to provide a list of people who convinced him.
One is Wolfhart Pannenberg, the great German theologian, historian.
I had to look up Wolfhart Pannenberg. I've not read any of his work, but I will keep it on my radar now.
One is William Lane Craig.
Sigh. I have an ever-growing playlist of responses to and responses from William Lane Craig on the resurrection.
Man who has responded goes by Paulogia.
He had a brain-dead Christian faith.
Like Stephen, I'll just point to a playlist of those external resources.
One is N.T. Wright with his magisterial tome, The Resurrection of the Son of God.
Somehow I haven't actually covered N.T. Wright yet, but I'm well aware of his work.
And the other is Gary Habermas.
Oh boy. Again, I have a growing playlist of responses to and from Gary Habermas on the resurrection.
When Paulogia explains this, he's gonna get it wrong.
Let's just say I'm considerably less impressed with these men than Stephen is.
And I've done a deep dive on that stuff, and I'm convinced that the resurrection of Jesus Christ happened as a real event in history.
Because people said it did.
Bing, bing, bing. Stephen's sources are claims. One could even concede these claims are inspired by testimony and still land at the reality that all you have is testimony, and all testimony is potentially false or mistaken. Those possibilities will always be more likely than the testimony reflecting a miracle. That's not saying miracles can't happen. That's merely acknowledging the epistemic reality that in the realm of testimony, lying or mistaken is always going to be more likely. You can't demonstrate a miracle by testimony alone.
Well, because of the various forms of testimony that we have, the historical evidence we have coming down to us from this day. Now, I may be wrong in that. I'm not, as a scholar, arguing on that about that myself.
But it is your personal belief.
But it is my personal belief.
Respect to Stephen for not trying to push his credentials in one area into another area. Or perhaps this was a defensive move, acknowledging that the case outside his field isn't as strong as he would like it to be, and doesn't want that to pollute his main project.
And I would tell you, I have reasons to believe that are well considered, and they are reasons not of subjective experience or subjective experience alone.
So, partly because of subjective experience, though.
But the reasons that are derived from having examined very detailed historical analyses of the relevant data.
My reasons for doubting are derived from having examined very detailed historical analysis of the relevant data. We're both out of our primary fields. What are we to learn from this show of hands?
And that's probably as far as we could take something in a discussion like this. But I do affirm that belief in such an extraordinary event should be well grounded in historical evidence and not something that we just believe because we want it to be true.
We agree on that. But for the life of me, I can't see why he thinks resurrection fits this criteria.
Well, is it historical evidence or is it historical statements of people who were discussing a thing that may or may not have happened that might have been legend?
Well, much historical evidence is also historical statement. It's testimony,
Sure.
Eyewitness or otherwise.
Stephen is admitting testimony alone, eyewitness, or most certainly otherwise. And, as we just said, testimony alone cannot lead to a conclusion of probable miracle.
Right, but this is an extraordinary event, right?
Right.
You're talking about a resurrection of a
Right.
person who died and
Right.
came back and
Right.
was the Son of God. This is a big claim.
Yeah, it is a big claim. What historians must do is evaluate the reliability of historical testimony if what's coming is historical testimony.
Mm-hmm.
One piece of historical testimony that's always been extremely compelling to me is the testimony of James.
That's interesting, because we have no first-hand reports at all about the testimony of James, the brother of Jesus. even if we accept that James wrote James, which we should not, that book also doesn't provide any testimony to the resurrection of Jesus.
Who is mentioned in the New Testament as one of the witnesses to whom Jesus appeared after the alleged resurrection event. He was also mentioned earlier in the New Testament as one of his brothers or half-brothers, depending on whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic Christian, how you view that.
If you're a Protestant, Jesus and James have the same mother, but different fathers, since Joseph didn't provide any DNA for Jesus. So they're half-brothers. If you're Catholic, Jesus and James have different fathers and mothers, but existed in some kind of blended family. So they're actually just stepbrothers.
What? Did we just become best friends? Yup. Do you want to go do karate in the garage? Yup.
But he was mentioned as one of his own family members who did not accept his crazy messianic claims, and he did not believe in him. But something changed James's mind.
Sadly, we have no first-hand account from James to tell us what that was. A veridical interaction with risen Jesus? Some kind of social contagion? A chance to earn a comfortable living on his brother's name? Or something else altogether? No idea. Or we could ask the bigger question. How do we know that James didn't believe early on? Only the Gospels tell us so. And these were written long after James's death. Maybe the earlier disbelief was invented or exaggerated for effect.
We later find that he becomes the leader of the Jerusalem Christian church, the early Jewish believers in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And we also then know from Josephus that James was stoned to death, martyred for his witness to the resurrection.
The records of James's death, as historically dubious as they may be, do not say he was martyred for his witness to the resurrection. While the governor was out of town, political rival Ananus accused some Christians, including James, of breaking the law and had them quickly killed. If it was ideological, it would have been done in the light of day. No, this was political.
Now, there's a kind of very simple argument, but it goes back to one of the early Christian writers, Eusebius, saying that people will lie to get out of trouble. They do it all the time. We see it in our politics. But people don't lie to get into trouble.
We're just assuming that they would let him lie or do anything to get out of trouble.
Once again, excellent point, Joe. It sure doesn't seem like James, the brother of Jesus, was given a chance to recant, or that anyone cared at all what his resurrection testimony was. Someone wanted James's power. They didn't care about silencing his message. When Stephen uses the word martyr for James, he's causing his listeners to falsely infer facts that are not in evidence.
There were many early Christians who died claiming to have seen the resurrected Jesus.
He says that, but Stephen can't name a single one, or at least not a single one who tells us firsthand that they were a witness, or for whom we have reliable information about how they died, or any information at all about why they died. Well, maybe Paul would count, but what Paul saw was a vision of Jesus after he left for heaven. So that's a whole different thing.
But in the case of James, we know that he expressed that testimony, and we know it from an external to the Bible source, namely Josephus.
Josephus doesn't tell us anything that James expressed or claimed to be witness to. This is simply an error on Stephen's part.
What do you think of...
So I think this is an example of, okay, here's an historical claim. How can we evaluate the reliability of that?
How we do not evaluate it is on how confidently later adherents believe it.
Witness, people will give their lives for an abstract philosophy that they believe to be true. People do not give their lives for a factual claim that they know to be false.
That speaks only to sincerity, not to the veracity. Sincerely correct and sincerely mistaken are both equally confident. And that's assuming direct eyewitnesses, which we almost certainly do not have.
That's lying to get into trouble.
True, but we don't know what James' mental state was. We don't know if James was schizophrenic. There's so many variables that could be taken into consideration.
The most natural variable is mistaken. People are mistaken all the time.
It's a question of weighing the preponderance of
Right.
the evidence and deliberating on it over time. I agree. I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not.
I understand.
Claiming that in sharing these things that I will.
No, I'm
persuade-
happy you
yeah,
are sharing them.
Yeah.
I'm happy you are sharing.
Stephen acknowledges that what convinced him isn't necessarily going to convince others.
You're just getting an insight into my thought processes.
That's all
I'm
I'm
very
trying to
much
do.
concerned I'm a philosopher, okay? Alvin Planning's great work with warrant and proper function. We say that philosophers say knowledge is justified true belief. For my religious beliefs, as much as for my scientific beliefs, I want to know what the justifications are. I want to have justifications for those beliefs.
Stephen already tipped his hand that part of his justification is subjective experience, and the rest is relying on testimony alone. As we've said, testimony alone can't provide sufficient justification. But Stephen doesn't even have testimony. He has hearsay, as Joe rightfully pointed out. But maybe Stephen has taken a page from his resurrection mentor, William Lane Craig.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
We shouldn't expect a scientist to be prepared for an impromptu history debate, so we can't fault Stephen too much. But my concern is that fans of Joe Rogan may not be familiar with all the problems with what was presented. If you want more examination of this faulty case, tap on the Paulogia versus Resurrection playlist on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.